This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The rain over Manhattan fell like static, blurring the city lights into smears of gold and red against the penthouse windows. Leonardo Vitale stood with his back to the glass, a tumbler of whiskey untouched in his hand, listening to his father's voice crackle through the phone speaker on the marble desk. "The Moretti wedding will happen, Leonardo. It was decided before you were born." "Nothing was decided," Leonardo said, his voice a low, controlled thing, like a blade sheathed but never far from the hand. "You made a promise to a dying man 20 years ago. That doesn't make it law. It makes it family," Salvatore Vitale said. "Camilla Moretti is beautiful, well-bred, and her father controls the ports from Naples to Palermo. You marry her, we control the entire Atlantic trade route without spilling a single drop of blood. You understand what that means?" Leonardo understood perfectly. He always understood. That was the curse of being the son who never made mistakes. People assumed his obedience was as reliable as his competence. "I have a company to run," he said. "Vitale Holdings doesn't need marriage alliances. It needs contracts, not brides. You are 32 years old and married to nothing but your office. The Morettis expect an announcement by the end of the month. Don't disappoint me, Leonardo. I am not asking." The call ended before Leonardo could answer, which was, he thought grimly, exactly how his father liked to leave a room, with the door already closed behind him. Leonardo set the glass down without drinking from it. Through the window, 30 floors below, the city moved in its indifferent rhythm, cars like blood cells through concrete veins. He thought of Camilla Moretti, a woman he'd met exactly 4 times in his life, always at funerals or forced dinners, always watching him with the calculating patience of someone counting the days until his last name became her leash. He would not be leashed, not by his father, not by the Morettis, not by an alliance dressed up as love. He picked up his phone and called the one man who never asked unnecessary questions. "Dante, I need someone found, discreet, someone who can convince an entire family that I'm already spoken for." There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a man who had worked for Leonardo Vitale long enough to know that discreet, from his employer's mouth, usually meant something was about to become very complicated. "An actress?" Dante asked. "An actress," Leonardo confirmed. "Someone talented enough to lie to a room full of liars and not blink." 3 days later, in a cramped studio apartment in Brooklyn, Sienna Marchetti sat on the edge of her bed, staring at an eviction notice as though staring hard enough might rewrite the numbers on it. Rain tapped against a window with a crack running through the corner, the same crack that had been there for 2 years because the landlord never fixed anything unless you threatened to call the city. She was 26 years old, had a theatre degree from a school she was still paying off, and had spent the last 4 years auditioning for roles that either went to someone's niece or paid so little she'd have made more folding shirts at the mall. Her mother's hospital bills sat in a drawer she couldn't bring herself to open, growing month by month like something alive and hungry. Her phone buzzed. An email from an agency she'd never heard of. "Confidential opportunity, high compensation, discretion required. Interview tomorrow, 10 a.m. She almost deleted it. She'd learned the hard way that anything promising high compensation and discretion in the same sentence in this city usually ended with a girl disappearing into something she couldn't act her way out of. But then she looked again at the eviction notice, at the number that might as well have been written in a foreign language for how impossible it felt to pay. And she typed back 3 words: "I'll be there." The address the next morning was not what she expected, not a seedy office above a bar, but the lobby of one of the tallest buildings in Manhattan, marble floors so polished she could see her own nervous reflection staring back at her. A woman in a sharp grey suit met her at the elevator without introducing herself and led her up 32 floors in silence. The office at the top was all glass and quiet money, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone in the room already knew. And behind the desk, rising as she entered, was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of expensive stone and old sins. Leonardo Vitale was tall, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked permanently set against the world, and eyes the colour of a storm just before it broke. Grey-green, sharp. Assessing her in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the room, the way a man might assess a horse he was considering buying, or a weapon he was considering trusting. "Miss Marchetti," he said, his voice low, faintly accented, each word placed like a stone in a wall. "Sit down." She sat. She would think, later, that this was the exact moment her old life ended, the moment she lowered herself into a leather chair across from a man who looked at her like she was both a problem and a solution, and felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with fear. "I have a proposition," Leonardo said. 90 days. You will pose as my girlfriend. You will attend family events, dinners, a gala, perhaps a wedding that is not yours. You will convince everyone who matters that I am unavailable. In exchange, I will pay you $2 million, deposited in increments, non-negotiable, non-refundable, regardless of outcome. Sienna's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. $2 million, enough to bury her mother's bills, enough to disappear the eviction notice like it had never existed, enough to breathe again. "Why me?" she managed. "Because you're an actress, and I need someone who understands that emotion, on command, is a performance, not a promise." His eyes didn't soften as he said it, and something about that honesty, brutal, unornamented, made her trust him more than any charm could have. "There will be rules, no real intimacy, no falling for the part. This ends in 90 days, cleanly, and you walk away with your money, and I walk away free. And if I say no, then I find someone else, and you go back to whatever it was that made you desperate enough to answer an email like the one you answered this morning." He said it without cruelty, simply as fact, and that too she would remember, that he never once tried to disguise what this was. Sienna looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the city sprawled, grey and glittering under the rain, indifferent to the 2 people in this room about to sign their names to a lie. "I'll need it in writing," she said finally. "Every clause." For the first time, something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of Leonardo Vitale's mouth. "Of course, Miss Marchetti. I don't deal in anything that isn't." The contract was 14 pages long, drafted by a lawyer who didn't ask questions, and notarized in an office with blackout curtains. Sienna read every line twice. Clause 7 stated that Leonardo Vitale would provide security at all times during public appearances. Clause 11 forbade either party from discussing the arrangement with press, family, or law enforcement. Clause 15 the one that made her hand still over the pen, stated that any physical affection performed for the benefit of onlookers did not constitute, imply, or create any real romantic or sexual relationship between the parties. She signed it anyway. $2 million did not leave room for hesitation. "There are things you need to understand before we begin," Leonardo said afterward, standing at the window of his office with his hands in his pockets, studying her the way he might study a market forecast, for weaknesses, for variables he hadn't accounted for. "My family is not like other families you may have encountered. My father built Vitale Holdings from a fish market and a gun. What you will see at dinners, at events, you will not ask questions about it. You will not mention it to anyone, not your friends, not your mother, not a diary you think no one will read." "I understand what kind of family this is, Mr. Vitale," Sienna said, holding his gaze even as her pulse thundered. "I'm from Brooklyn. I've seen men like your father before. Different suits, same eyes." Something flickered behind his storm-coloured gaze. Surprise, maybe, or the first faint stirring of respect. "Good. Then we understand each other." He crossed the room, close enough that she caught the low, expensive scent of cedar and something darker beneath it, something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "There is a dinner Friday, my mother's birthday. The entire family will be there. The Morettis will be there. You will need a dress, and you will need to know how to lie beautifully. Can you do that, Miss Marchetti?" "I've been lying beautifully since I was 19 and told a director I loved his terrible script," she said. "I think I can manage a dinner." That almost smile again, gone as quickly as it came. "We'll see." The dress arrived by courier the next afternoon. A deep wine-red gown, silk that moved like water, with a note in sharp, slanted handwriting. "Wear this. Nothing else will do. L.V." Sienna stood in front of her cracked bathroom mirror that Friday evening and hardly recognized the woman looking back. The dress fit as though it had been made for her, which, she realized with a small jolt, it probably had. Someone on Leonardo's staff had clearly taken her measurements from the photos in her portfolio and had this made in 3 days flat. That kind of precision unsettled her. Everything about Leonardo Vitale unsettled her in ways she didn't yet have language for. The car that picked her up was black, silent, driven by a man named Marco, who didn't speak except to confirm her name before the drive began. When they arrived at the Vitale estate in Westchester, an old stone mansion behind iron gates, lit gold from within like something out of a Gothic painting, Leonardo was waiting on the front steps in a black suit, his expression unreadable. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's about to walk into a war for. "You'll do," he said, which from him, she was beginning to understand, might have been the equivalent of poetry. He offered his arm. She took it and felt the warmth of him through the fabric, solid and unnervingly real for a man she'd met 3 days ago. "Rule 1 tonight," he murmured as they climbed the steps, his voice pitched low, meant only for her. "You are madly in love with me. Not fond, not comfortable. In love. My mother has an instinct for lies, and my father has a gun in his study he's fired more times than he's ever admitted. Do not give either of them a reason to look twice." "Should I be worried?" she whispered back, and hated the tremor she couldn't quite smooth from her voice. "Always," Leonardo said, and pushed open the door. The great hall inside was a blaze of candlelight and old money. A string quartet playing something sombre and beautiful, waiters gliding between clusters of men in dark suits and women dripping in jewellery that could have paid off Sienna's entire life twice over. Conversation dimmed in ripples as they entered, heads turning, and Sienna felt the full weight of dozens of assessing eyes settle on her like a physical thing. A striking woman in emerald silk broke away from a group near the fireplace, her dark eyes sharp and unreadable, sweeping over Sienna with the precision of a woman counting another woman's flaws. "Leonardo," the woman said, her voice honeyed, dangerous. "You didn't tell me you'd brought company." "Camilla," Leonardo said, and Sienna felt his hand settle at the small of her back, warm, deliberate, possessive in a way that made her breath catch despite herself. "This is Sienna, my girlfriend." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Sienna watched Camilla Moretti's beautiful face go very, very still. Camilla Moretti recovered in half a second, long enough that only someone watching very closely would have caught it, and Sienna was watching very closely, because her entire $2 million performance depended on reading every flicker of every face in this room. "Girlfriend," Camilla repeated, testing the word like a wine she suspected was corked. "How lovely. You never mentioned anyone, Leonardo, at Christmas." "I don't discuss my private life at family functions, Camilla. You know that." Leonardo's voice was mild, almost bored, but his hand at Sienna's back tightened by a fraction, a silent instruction. "Play along. Don't flinch." "Of course." Camilla's dark eyes slid to Sienna, cataloguing her, the dress, the way she stood, the absence of the kind of jewellery a Vitale girlfriend should have been dripping in. "And where did you two meet, Miss?" "Marchetti," Sienna supplied, and let herself smile the way she used to smile at auditions, warm and just slightly shy, the smile of a woman still a little disbelieving of her own luck. "At a gallery opening. He bought a painting I told him was overpriced. He bought it anyway just to prove me wrong." It wasn't true. None of it was true. But it came out of her mouth smooth as silk, and beside her she felt Leonardo's shoulders ease by a degree that told her she'd passed the first test. "How romantic," Camilla said, in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. "Sal must be thrilled." "My father doesn't know yet," Leonardo said. Tonight seemed as good a night as any to tell him. Something dangerous moved behind Camilla's eyes then. Not heartbreak, Sienna realized, with a small jolt of understanding, but calculation. The look of a woman recalculating a business deal that had just changed terms without her consent. Whatever Camilla Moretti felt for Leonardo Vitale, Sienna suspected it had very little to do with love, and everything to do with what his name could purchase for her family. That realization, oddly, made the whole evening easier. This wasn't a woman with a broken heart to protect. This was a chess match, and Sienna had been hired to be the opposing queen. "Leonardo." A new voice, deep and gravel-rough, cut through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the exchange with the polite, hungry interest of people who lived for drama they weren't personally involved in. Salvatore Vitale approached like weather. You felt him before you saw him, the way the room seemed to straighten in his presence, spines going a little more rigid, voices dropping a little lower. He was an older, harder version of Leonardo, the same storm-grey eyes, though his had gone flat and cold with decades of use, the same set jaw, but weathered now, scarred faintly along one cheekbone in a way that told stories he clearly had no intention of narrating at a birthday party. Papa? Leonardo's voice changed almost imperceptibly, still controlled, but the ice in it sharpened. I want you to meet someone. Siena Marchetti, my girlfriend. Salvatore's gaze swept over Siena, the way a customs officer might inspect a suspicious package. She held very still under it, chin lifted, refusing to let herself shrink. Girlfriend, Salvatore said slowly, echoing Camilla's earlier disbelief, though his carried none of her honeyed venom, just a flat, dangerous weight. This is news to me. It's news to everyone, apparently, Leonardo said. That's generally how private lives work, Papa. A long silence stretched, taut as wire. Siena felt her heartbeat in her throat. Somewhere behind Salvatore, she caught sight of two men in black suits who did not look like guests. Men who stood with the particular stillness of people trained to notice threats before they arrived, hands loose at their sides in a way that suggested they were never truly unarmed. Then, unexpectedly, Salvatore laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound, and clapped a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Well," he said, "at least you have taste. Beautiful girl." His eyes cut to Siena again, sharper now, assessing. "You'll come to Sunday dinner. I want to know everything about you, Miss Marchetti. Where your family comes from. What your father does." Siena's stomach dropped. She hadn't prepared a father. She hadn't prepared any of this. A fictional biography constructed on the spot, under the eyes of a man who, she was beginning to suspect, had built an empire on his ability to smell a lie before it finished forming. "My father passed away when I was young," she said, and this, at least, was true, which was perhaps why it came out steady. "It's just been my mother and me for a long time." Something in Salvatore's expression shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, the way a predator reconsiders prey that's shown an unexpected spine. "Difficult," he said. "Difficult women make the best wives. Camilla, don't you agree?" Camilla's smile could have cut glass. "Absolutely, Sal." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, careful lies, and Leonardo's hand never quite leaving Siena's back, a constant point of heat and pressure that she was disturbed to find herself leaning into rather than away from. By the time the car pulled away from the estate near midnight, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her feet in unfamiliar heels, and everything to do with the sheer effort of being someone else for 4 hours. "You did well," Leonardo said, watching her in the dim light of the car's interior, his tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone, in a way that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, almost human. "Your father terrifies me," Siena admitted. "He terrifies everyone. It's his favourite hobby." A pause. "You handled Camilla better than I expected." "She hates me." "She hates that you exist," Leonardo corrected. "There's a difference. Camilla doesn't want me. She wants what my name gets her family. You've become an obstacle to a business transaction, not a rival for my heart." He said it flatly, without irony, and Siena found herself unexpectedly disturbed by how easily he separated the two, as though love and business had never, in his experience, overlapped at all. "That's a very cynical way to see marriage," she said quietly. "It's the only way I've ever seen it." He looked out the window at the passing city, his jaw tight, something old and unspoken moving behind his eyes. "My mother married my father because her family owed his family a debt. She learned to love him, eventually, or learned to perform it well enough that no one could tell the difference. I don't intend to spend my life guessing which. Sienna didn't know what to say to that. She thought of her own parents, her father's laugh before the accident, her mother's hands still calloused from 30 years of work, and the particular ache of losing something real. She thought about how strange it was to sit beside a man who'd never had that, who spoke of love like a rumour he'd heard about, but never confirmed. "Well," she said finally, softer than she meant to, "I hope you get to find out someday. The difference, I mean." Leonardo turned to look at her then, something unreadable moving across his face in the passing streetlight, gone before she could name it. "Get some rest, Miss Marchetti," he said. "Sunday dinner will be worse." Sunday dinner was, as promised, worse. The Vitale dining room could have seated 40 comfortably. Instead, it held 12. Salvatore at the head of the table, his wife Renata at the foot, a quiet, elegant woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing and said even less, and around them a rotating cast of cousins, capos, and allied family members who all seemed to know exactly who Sienna was before she'd said a single word. She'd spent the 2 days prior building a biography with Leonardo's help, a crash course delivered over the phone in his clipped, efficient voice. "You grew up in Bay Ridge. Your mother was a seamstress. You studied theatre at NYU, which is true, so stick close to it. You've never been married. No siblings, so no one can trip you up asking about a brother who doesn't exist." "You're thorough," she'd said, half impressed, half unnerved. "I don't leave things to chance," he'd replied. "That's how people end up dead in this family, Miss Marchetti. Carelessness." The comment had stayed with her through the drive to Westchester, through the receiving line of family members, through the first course of a dinner that felt less like a meal and more like an interrogation dressed in linen napkins. "So, Sienna," Renata Vitali said, partway through the second course, her voice soft, but her eyes anything but. "Tell me how my son proposed you attend tonight. He's never brought anyone home. Not once. In 32 years. Sienna felt Leonardo go very still beside her. "He didn't really propose it so much as inform me," Sienna said lightly, reaching for the wine to buy herself half a second. Leonardo isn't much for asking permission, if you haven't noticed. A ripple of laughter around the table, genuine this time, and she saw Salvatore's mouth twitch at the corner. Beneath the table, Leonardo's hand found her knee, a brief press of fingers that might have been a warning, or might have been something closer to gratitude. She couldn't tell, and that uncertainty unsettled her more than his father's stare. "That sounds like him," Renata said, something almost fond entering her voice. "His father was the same. Told me we were getting married before he'd ever asked me on a proper date." Her eyes flicked to Salvatore, and for a moment something passed between them. Old, complicated, not quite bitter and not quite tender. "I hope you have more romance in you than that, Leonardo." "I sent flowers," Leonardo said dryly. "Does that count?" "It's a start," Sienna said, playing along, and was startled by how easy it was, how the words came without her having to search for them, as though some part of her had already begun to believe the story she was selling. Camilla, seated across the table beside her father, Antonio Moretti, a heavy-set man with cold, watchful eyes and hands like slabs of meat, watched the exchange with an expression of polite, deadly interest. "Leonardo," Antonio said, his accent thick, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man used to being listened to. Your father and I had certain understandings about the future, about family, about business. I hope this—" his eyes moved to Sienna, dismissive— "doesn't complicate things." The table went quiet. Sienna felt her pulse hammer against her throat. "Antonio," Leonardo said, his voice carrying an edge Sienna hadn't heard before. Not raised, never raised, but colder, harder, a blade drawn slowly enough that you felt the air change before you saw the steel. "My personal life is not a term of any business arrangement between our families. If you have concerns about the port contracts, I'm happy to discuss them Monday, in my office, like businessmen, not at my mother's table in front of the woman I love." The woman I love. The words landed in Sienna's chest like a struck match, and she had to remind herself forcefully that this was a performance, that Leonardo Vitale had said those exact words the way he might quote a stock price, with confidence, with precision, and with absolutely no feeling behind them. Antonio's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head, a small concession. "Of course, forgive an old man's directness." Later, after the plates had been cleared and the men retreated to Salvatore's study with cigars and low voices that Sienna suspected discussed far more than shipping routes, Renata found her alone on the terrace, the cold night air a relief after the suffocating warmth of the dining room. "You're good," Renata said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, looking out over dark gardens lit by scattered lanterns. "Better than good. I almost believed you at dinner." Sienna's stomach dropped. "Almost?" Renata's sharp eyes cut sideways to her, something knowing and not unkind in them. "I've been married to a Vitale for 35 years, Sienna. I know the difference between a performance and the real thing better than anyone alive. What I saw tonight, that was skill. Whatever's underneath it, I haven't decided yet." She paused, considering. "But my son looked at you tonight the way he's never looked at anyone. Whether that's part of the act or not, that, I think, is a question even he doesn't know the answer to." Sienna didn't know what to say to that. She thought of Leonardo's hand at her knee under the table, the flicker of something unnamed in his eyes in the car 2 nights ago. The way he'd said, "the woman I love," like a man testing the weight of an unfamiliar word in his mouth. "He's a complicated man," she said finally, which was the only true thing she could offer. "He is," Renata agreed. "He's also my son, and I've watched him build walls around himself since he was 12 years old, since he first understood what this family actually was. If you're the one who finally cracks them," she smiled, small and sad and knowing, "be careful with what you find underneath. Vitale men don't love halfway, Sienna. When it's real, it consumes them." She left Sienna alone on the terrace, with those words settling into her chest like something dropped from a great height. And it was long minutes before she trusted herself to go back inside. 2 weeks into the contract, Leonardo informed her, via a text message as terse as a telegram, that they would be attending the opening of a new club owned by Vitale Holdings, and that half the city's worst people would be there, which meant appearances mattered more than ever. The club, Ombra, occupied a converted warehouse near the waterfront, all black marble and smoked glass, and a baseline that thrummed up through the soles of Sienna's shoes the moment she stepped inside, on Leonardo's arm. He wore black, as he always did, the suit cut close enough to remind her, uncomfortably, of exactly how well built the man beside her was, a fact she'd been trying very hard not to notice for 2 weeks and failing more each day. "Smile," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm, sending an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "You look like you're walking into a funeral." "With your family, aren't I always?" she murmured back, and was rewarded with the ghost of a laugh, low and real, that did something dangerous to her pulse. They were seated in a roped-off section overlooking the dance floor, champagne appearing without being ordered, a rotating cast of business associates and family friends stopping by to pay their respects to Leonardo, and cast curious, assessing glances at Sienna. She'd gotten good at this. The smile, the light touch on Leonardo's arm, the practiced ease of a woman comfortable in a world of danger, dressed up as luxury. It was nearly midnight when the trouble started. A man approached their table, young, handsome in a sharp, dangerous way, with the loose confidence of someone who'd never been told no often enough. Sienna recognized him vaguely from the family dinner. Dario Moretti, Camilla's younger brother. "Sienna," Dario said, sliding into the booth beside her before Leonardo could object, close enough that she caught the sharp smell of expensive cologne and cheap intentions. "You look incredible tonight. Dance with me?" "I'm here with Leonardo," she said, keeping her voice light, but she felt the temperature at the table drop several degrees. "Leonardo won't mind one dance," Dario said, his hand settling on her knee under the table with a confidence that made her skin crawl. "Will you, Leo?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sienna had ever heard. She watched Leonardo's face, not angry, not visibly, but something in his eyes had gone utterly, dangerously still. The storm grey flattening into something colder, something that made the hair on her arms rise. "Take your hand off her," Leonardo said, quiet, almost pleasant, which somehow made it 100 times more terrifying than shouting would have been. Dario laughed, oblivious or reckless, and didn't move his hand. "Come on, Leo, it's one dance." Leonardo moved so fast, Sienna barely registered it, his hand closing around Dario's wrist, twisting it back at an angle that made the younger man's face go white, and a sharp, involuntary sound escape his throat. "I said," Leonardo repeated, still in that same low, pleasant voice, though his eyes had gone black with something Sienna had no name for. "Take your hand off her." Dario yanked his hand back, cradling his wrist, his handsome face twisted with pain and humiliation. "You're crazy, man! It's a dance!" "She's not something you touch without permission," Leonardo said. "Not Sienna. Not ever. Do you understand me?" Around them, conversation had died in a widening ripple, security materializing at the edges of the booth, with the practiced discretion of men used to diffusing exactly this kind of situation before it became a scene the club couldn't survive. Dario, wisely, chose retreat over pride, disappearing into the crowd with a final, venomous glance that promised this wasn't over. Leonardo watched him go, jaw tight, before turning to Sienna, something almost apologetic flickering across his face, an expression she hadn't seen on him before and wasn't entirely sure how to read. "Are you all right?" he asked, low, and his hand found hers under the table, warm and steady, entirely unlike the possessive violence of a moment before. "I'm fine," Sienna said, though her heart was still hammering, half from the confrontation and half from something else entirely. The way he'd looked at Dario. The raw, unfiltered fury in his eyes at another man's hand on her. It wasn't the reaction of a man performing a role. It had been too fast, too instinctive, too real. Leonardo, that wasn't... She hesitated, searching for the right words. That wasn't part of the contract. No, he agreed, quiet, his thumb tracing an absent line across her knuckles that she felt everywhere. It wasn't. Neither of them said anything else about it, but the air between them had shifted, subtle and irreversible, like a fault line settling into a new configuration. When he offered his hand a few minutes later, "Dance with me, since apparently that's expected tonight," she took it without hesitation and let him pull her onto the floor, into the crush of bodies and bass and coloured light. He danced like he did everything else, controlled, precise, but with an undercurrent of something barely restrained. His hand settled at the small of her back, pulling her closer than strictly necessary. And when she looked up at him, his eyes were already on her face, unreadable and intense, in a way that made her breath catch. "Rule 15, she reminded him softly, though her voice had lost most of its conviction. "No real intimacy." "This isn't intimacy," Leonardo said, his voice low, rough at the edges. "This is a dance." But his hand tightened at her waist as he said it, and neither of them moved away. And somewhere in the thrumming dark of Ombra, under 100 watching eyes and a bass line that drowned out coherent thought, the 90-day contract began, very quietly, to fracture. The drive home that night was silent, thick with something neither of them named. Sienna stared out the window at the passing lights, aware of Leonardo beside her, with a hyper-awareness that unsettled her. The warmth of his leg inches from hers, the faint scent of him still on her skin from the dance floor, the memory of his hand at her waist, like a brand. "You've never asked me why," Leonardo said eventually, breaking the silence, his voice quieter than she'd heard it, stripped of its usual armour. "Why the arrangement? Why I need this?" "I assumed it wasn't my business," Sienna said carefully. "It isn't, but I find myself wanting to tell you anyway." He looked out at the passing city, jaw tight. "My father promised me to Camilla Moretti when I was 12 years old. I've spent 20 years being told that my life belongs to a deal made before I could vote, drive, or refuse anything. I built Vitali Holdings into something that doesn't need the Moretti's ports or their money. I did it specifically so I would have leverage to refuse this marriage. And it still wasn't enough. My father doesn't listen to logic. He listens to consequences he can see." "So I'm a consequence," Sienna said softly. "You're a rebellion," Leonardo corrected, turning to look at her, something raw moving behind his eyes. "The first one I've ever allowed myself." Sienna's chest tightened at that, at the quiet vulnerability in his voice, so different from the cold, controlled man she'd met 3 weeks ago. "That's a lot of pressure to put on a fake girlfriend," she said, trying for lightness and missing by a mile. "You stopped feeling fake to me around the time you told my mother I don't ask permission for anything," Leonardo said, and the words hung between them, too honest, too dangerous, both of them realizing it a half-second too late. Sienna didn't answer. She couldn't, not without saying something she wasn't ready to admit even to herself. The rest of the drive passed in a silence that had changed character entirely, no longer uncomfortable, but charged, full of things unsaid, And when the car finally pulled up outside her building, Leonardo got out to walk her to the door, which he hadn't done before. "Thank you," he said, standing too close under the flickering hallway light, "for tonight, for not running when Dario made an ass of himself, for not running when I did." "You didn't make an ass of yourself," Sienna said. "You defended me." "I lost control," Leonardo corrected, something dark and self-critical in his voice. "I don't lose control, Sienna. Ever. It's how I've survived this family for 32 years. He was close enough now that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the storm grey of his eyes darkened almost to charcoal in the dim light. "You make me lose control." The air between them went taut as wire. Sienna's pulse hammered in her throat, and she was aware, with a clarity that frightened her, that if she leaned forward even an inch, this entire careful arrangement would collapse into something neither of them could take back. "Leonardo," she whispered, half warning, half something else entirely. He stepped back first, a visible, physical effort, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists at his sides, as though he didn't trust them not to reach for her. "Good night, Sienna," he said, rough, and turned and left before she could say anything else, before either of them could do something the contract's 15 clauses had never accounted for. She stood in the hallway long after his car had pulled away, her heart pounding, her mind replaying the words, "You make me lose control," on an endless loop, and understood, with the sinking, thrilling certainty of someone watching a wave rise before it breaks, that she was no longer entirely sure. This was still a performance. The following week brought a gala, the Vitale Foundation's annual charity dinner, an event that drew New York's wealthiest and most dangerous under one glittering roof. Sienna wore black this time, a dress Leonardo hadn't chosen, an act of quiet rebellion she wasn't sure he'd notice. He noticed. His eyes found her the moment she entered the ballroom, and something in his expression, hunger barely restrained, told her he'd noticed everything, the cut of the dress, the way her hair fell loose over one shoulder, the deliberate absence of jewellery that made her look like she belonged to no one, least of all him. "You're trying to test me," he murmured, finding her at the edge of the crowd, his hand settling at the small of her back, with the same possessive certainty as always. "I'm testing myself," Sienna admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "And?" "And I'm failing," she said, and watched something fierce and satisfied move across his face before he schooled it back into the cool, controlled mask he wore for the rest of the world. They danced twice that night, longer than propriety strictly required, and when Camilla Moretti approached midway through the evening, sharp-eyed watching for cracks, she found none to exploit. Only a couple who moved together like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks, who looked at each other like the room had emptied of everyone else. "You're very convincing," Camilla said afterward, cornering Sienna near the bar while Leonardo was pulled into a conversation with a senator whose campaign Vitale Holdings had quietly funded. "I almost believe it myself." "There's nothing to believe," Sienna said. "It's real." The lie came easily, automatically, except standing there under the chandelier light, watching Leonardo across the room, his eyes finding hers even mid-conversation with a man who controlled half the state's judiciary, Sienna wasn't entirely sure anymore which parts were the lie. The trouble came, as trouble often does, disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. Sienna had an audition, a real one, for a small independent film, The kind of role she'd have killed for 6 months ago, and now approached with the strange, dislocated feeling of stepping back into a life she'd nearly forgotten. She got the call back. She was celebrating with Marisol, her closest friend from acting school, in a bar in the Lower East Side, laughing for the first time in weeks without calculating every word, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Rule 11 of the contract states you don't discuss our arrangement. It doesn't say you can't be photographed with other men. Care to explain the man with his arm around you outside Ludlow House 20 minutes ago? Sienna frowned, confused, until she scrolled back through her memory. A man from Marisol's improv troupe, Jake, had thrown his arm around her shoulders in a group photo outside the bar earlier, entirely platonic, entirely innocent. She hadn't even registered it as anything worth noting. She texted back, "That's Marisol's friend. It was a group photo. Are you having me followed?" The reply came fast, too fast, betraying an urgency Leonardo would never have admitted to out loud. "I have security everywhere. I have interests. You're currently one of them." Something in that admission, "you're one of my interests," sent a complicated thrill through her that she immediately tried to suppress. "You're jealous," she texted, testing the water, half expecting a cold denial. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before his answer finally came. "I don't get jealous. I get informed." She laughed out loud, drawing a curious look from Marisol, and typed back, "That's the exact thing a jealous person says." No response. She smiled at her phone longer than she should have, aware of Marisol watching her with growing suspicion. "Who's that?" Marisol asked. "You've got a very specific face on right now. That's not audition news face. That's a man face." "It's complicated," Sienna said, which was, she realised, the single most honest sentence she'd spoken about her situation in weeks. "Complicated how?" "I'm dating my boss," Sienna said, which was close enough to the truth to be safe, and far enough from it to protect the 14 pages of legal paper that governed her entire relationship with Leonardo Vitale. "It's new. It's complicated." "Is he good to you?" Sienna thought about it. Really thought about it. Past the money, past the contract, past the danger that clung to Leonardo Vitale like cologne. She thought of his hand at her back in crowded rooms, the way he'd looked at Dario's hand on her knee, like he wanted to remove it from the man's body entirely. The raw honesty in his voice on her doorstep. "You make me lose control." "He's terrifying," Sienna said slowly, "and I think he might be the realest thing that's ever happened to me." Leonardo arrived at her apartment 40 minutes later, unannounced, dressed down in a way she'd never seen him. No tie, sleeves rolled to his forearms, an edge of something restless in his eyes that hadn't been there in their careful, controlled interactions at family functions. "You didn't need to come," Sienna said, opening the door, surprised at how her heart leapt despite herself. "I know," Leonardo said, and stepped inside without being invited, which was so unlike him, a man who calculated every move, that Sienna understood, with a jolt, exactly how unsettled he was. "Leonardo, it was a photo with a friend. I know that too." He turned to face her, close in the small space of her studio apartment, his eyes moving over her face like he was trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Sienna. I told myself I was checking on you because of security concerns. That's a lie. I came because I couldn't stand the thought of you laughing with someone else and not knowing why it bothered me so much. Leonardo. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said, quieter now, and there was something almost pained in his voice. A man confronting a variable he hadn't accounted for in an equation he'd thought was airtight. I hired you to solve a problem. I did not intend to want you the way I want you. The confession hung in the small apartment, raw and unguarded, and Sienna felt something in her chest crack open entirely. "How do you want me?" she whispered, though some part of her already knew, already felt the answer in the charged inch of space between them. "Completely," Leonardo said, and closed the distance between them, his hand rising to cradle her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted every cold, controlled thing she'd believed about him. "Recklessly, against every rule I wrote into that contract." His mouth found hers before she could answer, and it was nothing like the practiced, performative kisses they'd exchanged for cameras at public events. This was slow, searching, devastating in its sincerity, his hand sliding into her hair as though he needed something to hold on to. Sienna kissed him back with a hunger that frightened her, months of careful distance collapsing into this single, irrevocable moment. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, she understood that whatever this had started as, it was no longer a contract. It was something far more dangerous. "Clause 15, she managed, breathless, half laughing, half terrified. "Is officially void," Leonardo said against her lips, and kissed her again before she could argue. Morning light slanted through the crack in Sienna's window, falling across the bed where Leonardo Vitale lay, uncharacteristically still, watching her sleep with an expression she wouldn't have believed him capable of if she hadn't been the one waking to it. "You're staring," she murmured, eyes still closed. "I'm memorizing," he corrected, and she opened her eyes to find him propped on one elbow, hair mussed, the cold armour he wore like a second skin nowhere in evidence. He looked younger like this, less like the man who terrified boardrooms, and more like someone she suspected he rarely let himself be. "This complicates things," Sienna said, sitting up, pulling the sheet with her, suddenly aware of the 14 pages of legal paper sitting in a drawer across the city, of the $2 million still owed in installments, of 90 days that had never accounted for this. "Everything about you complicates things," Leonardo said, reaching to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "I've spent my entire adult life ensuring nothing was left to chance. And then I hired an actress to save me from an arranged marriage, and she became the only unplanned thing I've ever wanted to keep." "We still have 63 days on the contract," Sienna said quietly. "Your father still expects an announcement. Camilla's family still expects—" "I know what everyone expects," Leonardo said, an edge entering his voice, not directed at her, but at the situation itself, at a life built entirely around other people's expectations. "I've spent 32 years giving my father exactly what he expects. I'm done." He caught her hand, brought it to his mouth, pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a gravity that startled her. "I want to finish this contract because I want more time with you, Sienna. Not because my father needs convincing. I need convincing. I need to know this is real before I burn down everything I've built to keep it." Sienna's throat tightened. "It's real for me," she admitted, quiet, terrified of the admission and unable to hold it back any longer. "It stopped being an act somewhere around the night you nearly broke Dario Moretti's wrist." Leonardo's mouth curved, something dark and satisfied in the expression. He deserved worse. "You're possessive," she said, not quite an accusation. "Obsessively," he agreed, unashamed. "I make no apology for it. When something is mine, Sienna, I don't share it, I don't lend it, and I don't let another man put his hands on it and walk away without consequence." His eyes darkened, serious now. "You should know that about me before this goes any further. I am not a gentle man. I am not an easy one. I come from violence and I carry it, even when I try to keep it from you. If you want out, this is the moment to say so." Sienna considered him for a long moment. This cold, dangerous, devastatingly honest man who had just handed her, unprompted, the exact truth of himself, weapons and all. "I don't want out," she said. "I want in. All the way in, Leonardo. Danger included." Something shifted in his eyes. Relief, disbelief, a fierce and possessive joy he didn't bother hiding. He pulled her against him, and this time when he kissed her, there was no performance in it at all, nothing left to prove to anyone but themselves. They kept the change quiet, from the family, from the Morettis, from everyone but themselves, because both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the moment the contract became real, it also became more dangerous. A pretend relationship could be walked away from cleanly. A real one gave people leverage. But quiet didn't mean invisible, and 2 weeks later, at a business dinner meant to finalize a new shipping agreement between Vitali Holdings and a Chicago-based family called the Rossis, Salvatore Vitale watched his son pull out Sienna's chair with a tenderness that had nothing performative about it, and his sharp eyes narrowed with the particular focus of a man who'd spent his life reading people for a living. "You're different with her," Salvatore said later, cornering Leonardo near the bar while the Rossi patriarch was occupied elsewhere. "Since the gala, something's changed." "I care for her," Leonardo said simply, no longer bothering to disguise it, and watched his father's face for a reaction he couldn't quite predict. "Care," Salvatore repeated, testing the word. "That's a dangerous thing to admit in this family, Leonardo. You know what happens to men who love too openly. It becomes a lever someone else can pull." "I'm aware," Leonardo said, his jaw tight. "I've weighed the risk." "Have you weighed it against the Morettis? Against the port contracts? Against everything I've built for this family, everything I intended to pass to you?" Salvatore's voice had dropped, dangerous and low. "Antonio Moretti is not a patient man, Leonardo. He's already asking questions about why the engagement announcement hasn't come. If he decides this girl is an insult rather than an inconvenience, then he can take it up with me," Leonardo said, something cold and final entering his voice. "I am not marrying Camilla Moretti. I have told you this 100 times, Papa. I am telling you again for the last time. Find another way to secure the port contracts or lose them. I will not sell my life for shipping routes." Salvatore studied his son for a long, silent moment, something complicated moving behind his flat, dangerous eyes. Not quite anger, not quite pride, something that lived in the narrow space between the two. "Bring her to the house Sunday," he said finally. "If this is real, I want to see it up close. And Leonardo," his hand landed heavy on his son's shoulder, his voice dropping lower still, "if it is not real, if this is some elaborate game to buy you time, End it now, before Antonio Moretti decides to solve the problem himself. He is not a man who waits patiently for long." The warning settled into Leonardo's chest like a stone, and across the room, watching her laugh at something the Rossi patriarch's wife had said, entirely unaware of the storm gathering around her, Sienna had never looked more like something worth protecting, or more like a target. Sunday dinner, round 2, was a different animal entirely, not because the setting had changed, but because everything underneath it had. Sienna arrived at the Westchester estate with a knot of nerves in her stomach that had little to do with performance anxiety this time. She no longer needed to invent affection for the man beside her. What she needed now was to hide how much of it was real, in a house full of people trained since birth to detect exactly that kind of vulnerability. "You're quiet," Leonardo observed as they climbed the front steps, his hand finding the small of her back warm and grounding. "Your father's going to see it," Sienna said. "Whatever this is between us now, he's going to see it, and I don't know what that means for either of us." "Then let him see it," Leonardo said, surprising her with the steadiness in his voice. "I'm tired of hiding things in this family, Sienna. I've hidden my whole life, what I want, who I am underneath the version of me they built for their purposes. I'm not hiding this." Inside, the dinner unfolded with a different texture than before, Renata's sharp eyes softening as she watched her son laugh, really laugh, at something Sienna whispered to him during the second course. Salvatore, watching in a silence that gave nothing away, his fork moving methodically through his food, while his mind, visibly, worked through calculations none of them could see. It was after dinner, in the study, that the real conversation happened, Salvatore closing the door behind Leonardo and Sienna both, an unusual breach of the family's tradition of excluding women from business discussions. "Sit," Salvatore said, and it wasn't a request. Sienna sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, aware of Leonardo tense beside her. "I've built this family on contracts," Salvatore said, pouring 3 glasses of dark liquor without asking if anyone wanted one. "Business contracts, marriage contracts, even friendships in this world are contracts, whether anyone admits it or not. I understand contracts, Miss Marchetti. What I don't understand is what's sitting in front of me right now. A woman my son hired to lie for him, who now looks at him like she'd walk into gunfire for the man." His flat eyes cut to her, sharp and assessing. "Explain that to me." Sienna's heart hammered, but she held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I can't explain it, Mr. Vitali. It happened despite every rule we wrote to prevent it. I didn't plan to fall for your son. I planned to collect a paycheck and disappear at the end of 90 days. Somewhere in the middle of pretending, I stopped pretending. I don't have a better explanation than that." Silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Then, unexpectedly, Salvatore laughed. The same short, sharp bark she'd heard the first night, though it carried different weight now. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said in this study in 20 years. He looked at his son, something almost like approval settling into his hard features. "Your mother said the same thing to me once, almost word for word. I didn't believe her either, at first." "Papa," Leonardo said carefully, "does this mean—" "It means I'm not a fool, Leonardo, and I never was," Salvatore said, cutting him off. "I knew from the first dinner this wasn't what you claimed it was. I've been waiting to see if it would become real, or if you'd both crumble under the pressure of pretending." He studied them both for a long moment. "It became real. Good. That simplifies some things and complicates others considerably. Antonio Moretti, Leonardo said grimly. Antonio Moretti, Salvatore agreed, is not going to accept a broken promise gracefully. He has spent 2 decades planning his daughter's marriage into this family. When he learns it's truly off, not a temporary inconvenience, but a permanent one, there will be consequences. Not immediately. Antonio is patient, but he will look for a way to make us pay for the insult, and he will look for the weakest point to strike. His eyes moved to Sienna, deliberate, heavy with meaning. The weakest point being, of course, whoever he perceives as having taken his daughter's place. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Sienna felt Leonardo's hand find hers, gripping tight. "I'll handle Moretti," Leonardo said, low and dangerous. "You'll handle him carefully," Salvatore corrected, "or you'll bury someone you love before this business is finished. I've seen it before, Leonardo. I've buried people I loved because I moved too fast, thought too little, trusted the wrong calm before a storm." He set down his glass, the weight of decades in the gesture. "Protect her properly, or don't parade her in front of the Morettis at all. There's no middle ground in this family. There never has been." Later, in the car home, Sienna sat in silence, Salvatore's warning settling over her like a shadow she couldn't shake. "He's right, isn't he?" she said finally. "This isn't just about hurt feelings and cancelled engagements. Someone could actually try to hurt me." Leonardo's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the road, and when he answered, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before. Not the controlled coldness of business, but something rawer, closer to fear. "I will not let that happen," he said. "I have men watching your apartment already, watching your movements since the night at Ombra. I should have told you. I didn't want to frighten you." "I'd rather be frightened and prepared than protected and blind," Sienna said, and meant it, though her pulse hammered at the confirmation that danger had been circling her for weeks without her knowledge. "Understood," Leonardo said, and reached for her hand across the console, holding it the rest of the drive, like a man holding on to the one thing in his life that hadn't been calculated, negotiated, or bought. The weeks that followed took on a strange, suspended quality, danger humming beneath the surface of every family event, every public appearance, while underneath it, something soft and undeniable continued to grow between Leonardo and Sienna, private and fierce, protected in the small hours they managed to steal from a world that wanted pieces of both of them. They fell into rhythms neither of them had planned. Sunday mornings in his penthouse, sunlight falling across his enormous bed while he read financial reports and she memorized lines for the film role she'd landed, both of them content in a silence that had never once felt awkward. Tuesday dinners at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village where the owner knew Leonardo by name and always seated them in the corner booth, away from prying eyes, where he'd tell her, in fragments, about the childhood he rarely discussed. His mother teaching him to cook when his father was away on business, no one explained to a 7-year-old. The first time he'd understood, at 9, exactly what kind of family he'd been born into, watching his father clean a gun at the kitchen table with the same casual efficiency other fathers used to clean fish. "Does it ever stop feeling normal?" Sienna asked one night, tracing the lines of his palm with her fingertip as they lay tangled together in his enormous bed, the city glittering below them through floor-to-ceiling windows. "All of it. The danger, the violence underneath everything." "It stopped feeling normal the moment you asked me that question," Leonardo admitted, watching her with an intensity that still, weeks in, made her breath catch. Before you, I didn't think about it much. It was simply the water I'd always swum in. Now I think about it constantly, about what it means for you, about what it could cost you, being near me. I chose this, Sienna said firmly. I'm choosing it every day, Leonardo. Not for the money anymore. For you. The money's still coming, he said. Don't think falling for me exempts you from getting paid, Miss Marchetti. I signed a contract. She laughed, the sound easy in the quiet of the room. Careful, Mr. Vitale. That almost sounded like a joke. I've been known to make one, occasionally, Leonardo said, and kissed her before she could tease him further, slow and thorough. And for a while, the danger circling the edges of their world receded into something distant and unimportant. But it never disappeared entirely. Dante found Leonardo in his office one Thursday afternoon, his expression grim in a way that immediately put Leonardo on alert. Antonio Moretti's been making calls, Dante said without preamble, to some old contacts, people who owe him favours from before your father's time. He's asking questions about Sienna Marchetti, her background, her family, her financial history. He's building a file. Leonardo's blood went cold. What kind of file? The kind you build on someone before you decide what leverage to use against them, Dante said grimly. He found the eviction notice, Leonardo. Her mother's medical bills. He knows exactly how desperate she was when you hired her. And I suspect he's going to use that, either to convince himself this was purely transactional and therefore beneath his daughter's dignity to worry about, or worse, to approach Sienna directly and offer her more money than you're paying to walk away quietly. He wouldn't, Leonardo said, though even as he said it, he knew Antonio Moretti absolutely would. He's already tried once, Dante said, and Leonardo's stomach dropped. One of my men intercepted a message sent to Sienna's agency 2 days ago. An offer. Anonymous, but the numbers point back to a Moretti shell account. $500,000, Leonardo, to disappear from your life quietly before the 90 days end. Leonardo's hands curled into fists on his desk, fury rising through him like a tide he had to physically fight to control. She didn't mention it. Maybe she doesn't know, Dante said, or maybe she does and hasn't decided what to do about it yet. The thought lodged in Leonardo's chest like a blade, not fear of losing her to Moretti's money exactly, but something worse. A creeping uncertainty he hadn't felt since he was a boy, watching his father count bodies like blessings. What if, after everything, she chose the safety of walking away over the danger of staying? He found her that evening at her apartment, and something in his face must have betrayed him, because she was on her feet the moment he walked through the door, alarm written across her features. What happened? Antonio Moretti offered you money to disappear, Leonardo said, watching her face carefully, searching for any flicker of guilt, of consideration, of anything that would confirm his worst fear. $500,000, 2 days ago. Were you going to tell me? Sienna went very still. I never received an offer, Leonardo. I swear to you. I have no idea what you're talking about. Relief crashed through him, so sharp and sudden it nearly buckled his knees, followed immediately by a colder, sharper fury. Then it was intercepted, he said, half to himself, before it reached you. Which means Moretti's testing the waters, gathering information before he makes a direct move. He crossed the room, cupping her face in both hands, needing to touch her, to confirm she was real and here and not being weighed against a price tag by a man who saw people as currency. "I'm sorry. I should never have doubted you, even for a second." "But you did," Sienna said quietly, searching his face. "Even for a second." "I did," Leonardo admitted, unable to lie to her, "not about this. I've spent my whole life watching people choose money over loyalty, Sienna. It's the only currency I truly trust, because it's the only one that's never lied to me. Trusting a feeling, trusting that you'd choose me over $500,000 and a clean exit from a dangerous family, that's harder for me than it should be." Sienna's expression softened, understanding threading through the hurt. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, covering his hands with hers. "Not for $500,000, not for 10 million. You need to understand that completely, or this is never going to work." "I'm trying," Leonardo said, low, honest. "You're the hardest thing I've ever had to trust, precisely because you're the first thing I've ever actually wanted to keep." Camilla Moretti had never been a woman who lost gracefully. She'd watched for 6 weeks as her carefully engineered future collapsed in slow motion. Leonardo Vitale, the man her father had promised her since childhood, growing visibly, undeniably in love with a Brooklyn actress with nothing to her name but a theatre degree and a dying mother's medical debt. It should have been simple to dismiss, a temporary infatuation that would burn itself out under the pressure of family expectations. Instead, it had only grown stronger, more real, more insufferably permanent with each passing week. She found Sienna alone, for the first time, at a fundraiser for a children's hospital that both families had been obligated to attend. Leonardo pulled away by a business associate, Sienna standing at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of untouched champagne, watching the crowd with the particular vigilance she'd developed over weeks of navigating a world that wanted to devour her. "Sienna," Camilla said, sliding up beside her with a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "We haven't had a chance to speak properly. Just us." "I didn't realize we needed to," Sienna said carefully. "I think we do." Camilla's gaze swept the room, then settled back on Sienna with unsettling focus. "I know what you were hired to do, Sienna. I've known since the first night. A contract, 90 days, a convincing performance to save Leonardo from a marriage he didn't want. It was clever, actually. I almost admired it." Sienna's pulse spiked, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult us both by lying," Camilla said, not unkindly, though there was steel underneath the softness. "I have my own sources, Sienna. Did you know Leonardo's assistant, the one who arranged your first interview? She used to work for my family before she went to the Vitales. Loyalty is complicated in this world. Sometimes it flows in more than one direction." Sienna's stomach dropped. If Camilla knew about the contract, the real terms, the money, the 90 days, then Antonio Moretti likely knew as well, and everything Salvatore had warned about suddenly felt far more immediate. "What do you want, Camilla?" Sienna asked quietly, abandoning the pretense. "I want what I've wanted since I was 14 years old, and my father told me I would marry Leonardo Vitale someday," Camilla said, and for the first time something raw slipped through her polished exterior. Not love, Sienna realized, but something closer to desperation. the particular anguish of a woman who'd built her entire identity around a future that had just been stolen from her. I want the life I was promised. The ports, the alliance, the security of a name that would protect my family for another generation. Do you understand what happens to my family if this marriage doesn't happen, Sienna? My father has enemies who've been waiting for decades for the Vitali alliance to crumble. Without it, we're vulnerable in ways you can't possibly comprehend. That's not my problem to solve, Sienna said, though not without sympathy. She recognized, with an uncomfortable jolt, the particular fear of a woman whose entire future had been decided by forces beyond her control. A fear she herself had lived with in a different form for years. It became your problem the moment you took the money, Camilla said, and her voice hardened again, the softness gone as quickly as it had appeared. I'm not here to threaten you, Sienna, whatever you might think. I'm here to offer you a way out before this gets worse than either of us can control. My father is not a patient man. He's already decided that if the engagement doesn't happen through diplomacy, he'll find another way to secure what he needs. I don't know exactly what that means, and honestly, I don't want to know. But I do know that you're the only variable in this entire situation that can be removed without a war. The threat, though delivered in soft, almost pitying tones, landed with the weight of a blade. Are you saying my life is in danger? I'm saying my father does not lose gracefully, Camilla said, and neither, I suspect, does Leonardo. If the two of them collide over this, Sienna, people get hurt. That's simply how this world works. I would rather you walk away with your $2 million and your life intact than end up a casualty in a war between two families that neither of us chose to be born into. Sienna stood very still, Camilla's words settling into her chest like ice water. Why tell me this? What do you get out of warning me? For a moment, something almost human flickered across Camilla's carefully composed features. Because, despite everything, I don't actually want you dead, Sienna. I want my future back. Those aren't the same thing, whatever my father might believe. She set down her untouched champagne glass. Think about it. You have time, but not much. Once my father decides on a course of action, he doesn't reconsider. She disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Sienna standing alone with her heart hammering and a decision suddenly, terrifyingly immediate. Walk away and save herself the danger, or stay and risk everything for a love that had started as a lie and become the truest thing she'd ever felt. Across the ballroom, Leonardo's eyes found hers through the crowd, some instinct alerting him that something had shifted, and he began making his way toward her with the focused intensity of a man who'd sensed danger circling something he considered his to protect. Sienna made her decision before he even reached her. She was staying, whatever it cost. She didn't tell Leonardo about Camilla's warning that night. She told herself it was because the fundraiser wasn't the place, because she needed time to process it herself before bringing it to him, because she didn't want to hand him one more reason to lock her away behind an even thicker wall of security and become someone she'd have to fight to still recognize. The truth, buried underneath all of that, was simpler and uglier. She was afraid that telling him would confirm something they'd both been avoiding, that this relationship, however real, however deeply she'd fallen, might genuinely get one or both of them killed. She held the secret for 4 days, and in those 4 days something in her began to fray. You're distracted, Leonardo said on the fourth night, watching her across the dinner table in his penthouse with the particular sharp attention he reserved for problems he hadn't yet solved. You've been distracted since the fundraiser. What happened? Nothing happened, Sienna said, too quickly, and watched his eyes narrow. Sienna? His voice carried a warning now, low and dangerous, though not directed at her, directed at whatever threat he'd already begun to suspect existed. I built an empire by reading people who lie for a living. Don't insult us both. She set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly, and told him. Camilla's approach, the warning about Antonio, the veiled threat wrapped in something almost like sympathy. Leonardo's expression darkened with each word, his jaw tightening, a muscle working beneath the skin as he fought to keep his composure. 4 days, he said when she finished, his voice dangerously quiet. You knew for 4 days and said nothing. I didn't know how to tell you, without you locking me in this penthouse behind 6 armed guards, Sienna said, defensive now, though she recognized, even as she said it, that she was deflecting from the deeper truth. That is exactly what I should do, Leonardo said, rising from the table, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal, fury and fear warring visibly across his features. Antonio Moretti approached you with a veiled threat through his own daughter, and you decided to sit on that information for 4 days. Do you understand what could have happened in those 4 days, Sienna? Do you understand what these people are capable of? I understand better than you think, Sienna snapped back, her own fear finally boiling over into something sharper. I've spent 2 months learning exactly what your family is capable of, Leonardo. I don't need a lecture. I need you to trust that I can handle information without falling apart, without needing to be wrapped in bubble wrap and hidden away like something too fragile to make its own decisions. This isn't about fragility, Leonardo said, his voice rising for the first time since she'd known him, genuine anger cutting through his usual control. This is about the fact that I love you, and the thought of losing you to Antonio Moretti's temper terrifies me more than anything I have ever faced in this life, and you kept that fear from me for 4 days. The words, I love you, landed in the room and stopped them both cold, neither having said it aloud before, both too careful, too aware of the fragile, dangerous ground they stood on to risk the vulnerability of the phrase. It hung in the air now, undeniable, impossible to take back. Sienna's anger drained out of her in an instant, replaced by something raw and aching. You love me. Obviously, Leonardo said, still frustrated, though his voice had gentled. I've loved you since the night at Ombra, probably before that, if I'm honest with myself, which I generally try not to be. I love you, and that terrifies me, because loving someone in this family has always meant eventually losing them to the exact kind of danger you just described to me over dinner, like it was a minor inconvenience. I love you too, Sienna said, the words breaking something open in her chest, months of careful distance and professional boundaries collapsing entirely. That's exactly why I didn't tell you right away, Leonardo, because I knew what it would do to you. And I wanted one more day of pretending we were just 2 people falling in love, instead of 2 people who might get each other killed. Leonardo crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperate tightness that spoke louder than any words could have. Never again, he murmured into her hair. Whatever it is, however small, however terrifying, you tell me immediately. I can't protect you from what I don't know, Sienna. Okay, she whispered, and meant it, though some part of her recognized, with a chill she couldn't quite shake, that they'd just crossed into a phase of this relationship neither of them could walk back from. Real love, real danger, real stakes, no more pretending, no more contract to hide behind. 60 days remained. It no longer felt like nearly enough time. The attack came on an ordinary Thursday evening, 3 weeks before the contract's end, and it came without warning, which was precisely the point. Sienna had left a late rehearsal for the independent film, her first real role in over a year, a small but pivotal part that had reminded her, in quiet moments between takes, that she'd once had a life entirely her own, before Leonardo Vitale had walked into it like a storm front. Marco, Leonardo's driver, waited outside as always, the black car idling at the curb in the thin light of a street lamp. She never made it to the car. 2 men emerged from the shadows of the alley beside the studio, moving with the kind of coordinated speed that spoke of training, not opportunism. Sienna had half a second to register danger before a hand closed over her mouth and an arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward into the dark. She fought, years of stage combat training kicking in on pure instinct, her elbow driving back into a solid chest, a heel connecting with a shin hard enough to draw a grunt of pain. But there were 2 of them, and the alley was empty, and her scream died half-formed against a gloved palm. Marco reached them seconds later, having heard the scuffle, gun already drawn, but by then one of the men had a blade pressed to Sienna's throat, close enough that she felt the cold kiss of steel against her pulse. "Tell Vitale," the man said, his voice flat, professional, entirely devoid of the personal malice she might have expected, that Antonio Moretti extends his regrets. This didn't need to happen. His son should have honoured the agreement his family made 20 years ago. "Let her go," Marco said, gun trained steady despite the danger, "or I put a bullet in your skull before you finish that sentence." "Then she dies with me," the man said calmly, and Sienna felt the blade press harder against her throat, a thin line of pain blooming there, and understood, with a clarity that cut through the terror, that these were not amateurs making idle threats. This was exactly the kind of danger Salvatore had warned her about, materialized in a dark alley on an ordinary Thursday. What happened next unfolded in the space of a few violent, chaotic seconds. Marco's phone, left on an open line to Leonardo since the moment the scuffle began, transmitting everything. The distant, rapidly approaching sound of tires screeching against pavement, and then Leonardo himself, arriving with a speed that defied physics, 3 of his men fanning out behind him, guns already drawn. "Let her go," Leonardo said, and his voice, Sienna would remember this for the rest of her life, carried none of the controlled coldness she'd grown used to. It was pure, undiluted fury, barely leashed, the voice of a man standing on the exact edge of violence he'd spent his whole life trying to contain. "Vitale," the man holding Sienna said, unbothered, though his companion had gone visibly tense at the sudden arrival of armed men. "This is a message, not a war. Let us leave, and the girl walks away with a scratch. Push this further, and it becomes something neither family can walk back." "You put a blade to her throat," Leonardo said, taking a slow step forward, his gun raised, aimed with lethal precision. And you think I'm interested in negotiating the terms of your exit? Leonardo, Sienna managed, her voice shaking but clear, meeting his eyes over the shoulder of the man who held her. I'm okay. Just think. Please think before you do something we can't undo. Something in her voice reached him. She watched it happen, watched the fury bank down into something colder, more calculating, the businessman reasserting control over the man who wanted more than anything to put a bullet through the skull of the person threatening the woman he loved. Fine, Leonardo said finally, lowering his weapon by a fraction, though his eyes never left the blade at Sienna's throat. You walk away, today, but you tell Antonio Moretti that if he ever sends anyone near her again, anyone for any reason, I will burn every port his family controls to the ground and salt the earth underneath them. This was his one warning. There won't be a second. The man considered this for a moment, then released Sienna abruptly, shoving her forward into Leonardo's waiting arms while he and his companion melted back into the shadows of the alley, disappearing before Leonardo's men could react. Leonardo caught her, one arm wrapping around her with bruising force, his other hand cupping her face, checking the thin line of blood at her throat with hands that trembled. The first time Sienna had ever seen him lose his composure so completely. I'm okay, she said again, though her voice shook now, adrenaline crashing through her system. Leonardo, I'm okay. You are not okay, Leonardo said, his voice raw, breaking in a way she'd never heard. You had a knife against your throat because of me, because of this family, because of a war I've spent my whole life trying to stay out of. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, and she felt him shaking, this cold, controlled, dangerous man shaking like a leaf in her arms. I almost lost you tonight. I almost lost you, and I would have burned this entire city down and not felt a single moment of regret. But you didn't, Sienna whispered, holding him just as tightly. You stopped. For me. For you, Leonardo agreed, pulling back just enough to look at her, his storm-grey eyes wet with something he'd probably deny later. I would stop a war. I would start one too, without hesitation, if it came to that. Do you understand now what you mean to me? Sienna understood. Standing in that dark alley, blood drying at her throat, the man she loved shaking with barely contained violence around her, she understood completely. And something in her, some final wall of careful distance, crumbled entirely. Take me home, she whispered. Please, I just want to go home. Leonardo carried her to the car himself, refusing to let her walk, and held her the entire drive back to the penthouse, his jaw set with a grim, terrible resolve that told her this was far from over. Leonardo didn't sleep that night. Sienna woke twice, disoriented, reaching for him in the dark of his enormous bed, and found him each time standing at the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and lethal in a language she didn't fully understand but recognized the tone of instantly. A man giving orders that would end in violence. Leonardo, she said the second time, sitting up, watching him with growing alarm. What are you doing? Protecting you, he said, ending the call, turning to face her, his expression carved from stone. I've moved 20 men to cover this building around the clock. Your apartment is being watched. The film set is being watched. You will not leave my sight without at least 2 of my people within reach, starting tonight. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Sienna pushed the sheets back, crossing the room to stand in front of him, searching his face for the answer she already dreaded. What are you planning to do to Antonio Moretti? Leonardo's jaw tightened. What needs to be done? That's not an answer.
It's the only one you're getting tonight, Leonardo said, and for the first time since they'd fallen into each other completely, Sienna saw the wall come back up. Not the cold performance of their first weeks, but something worse, a genuine retreat into the version of himself built for war, the version she'd only glimpsed before in flashes. I won't be shut out of decisions that put me at risk, Sienna said, refusing to back down, though her voice shook slightly. If you're planning something that could start a war, I have a right to know, Leonardo. My life is currently a bargaining chip in this conflict. That gives me a stake in how it ends. Something in her argument reached him, and he sighed, some of the rigid tension leaving his shoulders as he pulled her against him. Antonio Moretti sent men to threaten you. In this world, that cannot go unanswered without inviting worse. I'm not planning a war, Sienna. I'm planning a message strong enough to end this before it becomes one. What kind of message? Leonardo's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. You're going to kill someone, Sienna said quietly, horror threading through her voice. I'm going to ensure the men who put a knife to your throat never threaten anyone again, Leonardo said, his voice flat, final. That's the only language men like that understand, Sienna. It's not a debate. It's survival. And what happens after? Sienna pressed, refusing to let it go. What happens when Antonio retaliates for whatever you're about to do? Where does it end, Leonardo? At what point does someone stop, or does this just keep escalating until one of us is dead? The question hung in the room, heavy and unanswerable, and Sienna watched something crack behind Leonardo's carefully controlled eyes. The recognition, perhaps for the first time, of exactly how deep and generational this cycle of violence ran. How many people before them had asked the same question and never found an answer that didn't end in a funeral. I don't know, Leonardo admitted finally, quiet, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. I've never had to know before, Sienna. Before you, I didn't have anything precious enough to make me question the rules of this world. I simply survived it, the way my father survived it, the way his father did before him. You've made me want something different. I just don't know if it's possible to have it and stay alive. Sienna took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her, her own eyes fierce despite the tears gathering there. Then find a way that doesn't end in more bodies. Please, Leonardo. I don't want to build a life with you on a foundation of more violence. I've seen enough of it in the last 24 hours to last me a lifetime. Leonardo was quiet for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Not capitulation exactly, but a recalibration. The beginnings of a different strategy taking shape. There might be another way, he said slowly. Antonio doesn't actually want war, Sienna. War is expensive, unpredictable, bad for business. What he wants is his daughter's future secured, his family's position protected. If I can offer him something else, a different alliance, a different security, he might stand down without either of us having to bury anyone. What kind of alliance? The Rossi family, Leonardo said, thinking aloud now, the businessman in him reasserting control over the warrior.
They've been trying to expand into the same ports Antonio controls for years. If I broker a deal that benefits both families without requiring a marriage, gives Antonio what he actually needs, security, capital, protection from his own rivals, he might accept it as an alternative to Camilla marrying into our family. Would he take it? I don't know, Leonardo admitted, but it's a conversation worth having before I do something that can't be undone. He pulled her close again, pressing a kiss to her forehead, something like gratitude moving through his voice. Thank you for pushing back. I needed someone in my life who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm about to make things worse. That's my job now, apparently, Sienna said, managing a weak, exhausted smile, along with pretending to be your girlfriend for money. You stopped being paid to pretend weeks ago, Leonardo said softly. You know that. I know, Sienna said, and let herself be held. Let herself believe, for one fragile moment, that there might be a version of this story that ended without more blood. She didn't yet know how wrong that fragile hope would prove to be. Not because Leonardo's plan would fail, but because the true danger circling them had never been Antonio Moretti at all. The meeting with Antonio Moretti took place a week later, on neutral ground. A private room at a restaurant owned by neither family, chosen specifically for its reputation as sacred, untouchable territory, where business could be discussed without the immediate threat of violence. Sienna wasn't present, Leonardo had insisted, and for once she hadn't argued, understanding instinctively that some conversations required the particular language of men who'd spent their lives negotiating in the space between diplomacy and threat. She waited at the penthouse, pacing, checking her phone every few minutes, until finally, 3 hours later, Leonardo returned, his expression unreadable in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. Well? She asked, crossing the room to meet him. He accepted the alternative arrangement, Leonardo said, and something in his voice made relief and unease war within her simultaneously. The Rossi partnership, expanded port access, additional security guarantees. He's willing to let the marriage question die quietly, save face by announcing that Camilla chose to pursue her own path rather than admit the alliance fell through. That's good, Sienna said carefully. Isn't it? It's good, Leonardo agreed, though something in his expression remained troubled. But something about the negotiation bothered me, Sienna. Antonio agreed too easily. A man who sent armed men to threaten you 3 weeks ago doesn't simply fold because I offer him a better business deal. He's not a man who forgives insults that quickly, not even for money. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Leonardo said slowly, that the attack in the alley might not have come from Antonio at all. The realization settled over the room like a shadow, and Sienna felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Then who? I don't know yet, Leonardo admitted, but I intend to find out. The answer came 2 days later, delivered not through careful investigation, but through betrayal so close to home it took Leonardo's breath away. Dante found him in his office, his expression grim in a way that immediately signalled catastrophe. Leonardo, I need to show you something. The security footage he pulled up was grainy, time-stamped from the night of the attack. Footage from a camera Sienna hadn't known existed, positioned across the street from the studio where the rehearsal had taken place. It showed the 2 attackers approaching the alley, but it also showed something else. A car parked half a block away, idling, its occupant watching the entire scene unfold without intervening, without alerting anyone, simply observing.
The license plate, when Dante zoomed in, traced back to a vehicle registered to Vitale Holdings. "Whose car is that?" Leonardo asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Camilla Moretti's," Dante said. "She was there, Leonardo. She watched the entire thing happen and did nothing." The betrayal landed like a physical blow. Leonardo thought of the fundraiser, of Camilla's carefully worded warning to Sienna. "My father does not lose gracefully." A warning that, he now understood with sickening clarity, hadn't been a kindness at all, but a calculated piece of theatre, planted to shift suspicion entirely onto her father, while she orchestrated the danger herself. "Get her here," Leonardo said. "Now." Camilla arrived within the hour, summoned under the pretense of finalizing details for the announcement that the arranged marriage was officially dissolved. She strode into Leonardo's office with her usual composed elegance, though something flickered across her face when she saw the security footage already displayed on the wall screen behind him. "Explain this," Leonardo said, his voice controlled in the way that terrified people far more than shouting ever could. Camilla's composure cracked, slowly, like ice under pressure. "Leonardo, you hired men to threaten Sienna," Leonardo said, each word precise, deadly. "You let me believe it was your father, watched me negotiate an entire treaty to appease a man who had nothing to do with it, while you sat half a block away and watched a blade get pressed to the throat of the woman I love." "I didn't want her hurt," Camilla said, and for the first time genuine emotion broke through her carefully maintained mask. Desperation, raw and ugly. "I told them to frighten her, that's all, to scare her into taking the money and leaving. I never authorized a blade at her throat, Leonardo, I swear to you." "You authorized armed men to accost her in a dark alley," Leonardo said, rising from his desk, his fury a controlled, terrible thing. "What did you think would happen, Camilla? That they'd offer her tea and a polite conversation? I was desperate." Camilla's voice broke entirely now, the composed heiress dissolving into something rawer, more human. "You don't understand what it's like, Leonardo, watching my entire future disappear because you fell in love with someone else. My father will disown me if this alliance collapses entirely. Do you understand that? I have spent my whole life being told my only value is the marriage I would make. Without it, I am nothing to my own family." Something in her desperation gave Leonardo pause. Not forgiveness, never that, but a flicker of understanding for a woman who'd been shaped by the same brutal, transactional world that had shaped him, who'd simply had far less power to fight back against it. "That does not excuse what you did," he said, quieter now, though no less final. "You endangered her life, Camilla. There is no version of this conversation that ends without consequences." "What are you going to do?" Camilla asked, and for the first time real fear entered her voice. Leonardo considered her for a long, cold moment, weighing justice against mercy, family alliance against personal fury, before finally speaking. "You're going to tell your father everything," he said. "Every detail. And then you and I are going to decide, together, what happens next. Because if I handle this alone, Camilla, I promise you, you will not like my solution." Antonio Moretti's face, when his daughter finished her confession in Leonardo's office 2 hours later, went through a transformation that Sienna, finally allowed into the room, her hand gripped tight in Leonardo's, would remember for years. Shock, giving way to fury, giving way finally to a grief so profound it seemed to age him a decade in the space of a single conversation.
You endangered a life, Antonio said to his daughter, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, to preserve a marriage that was never truly yours to save. Do you understand what you've done, Camilla? Not just to this family's honor, but to your own soul. Papa, I was trying to protect our future. You were trying to protect yourself, Antonio said, cutting her off. And in doing so, you nearly started a war that would have gotten us both killed. Vitale men do not forgive threats against the people they love. I have known that my entire life. I built our alliance with his family on that exact understanding. He turned to Leonardo, something old and weary in his eyes. I owe you an apology, Leonardo. I did not authorize this. I would never have authorized this. I believe you, Leonardo said, and Sienna felt some of the tension in his frame ease slightly, though not entirely. But your daughter still endangered the woman I love, Antonio. That cannot simply be forgiven with an apology. What do you want? Antonio asked, his voice heavy with resignation. Leonardo considered this for a long moment, his eyes moving to Sienna, seeking something, permission perhaps, or simply the reassurance of her presence before he made a decision that would shape the rest of this delicate diplomatic disaster. I want the alliance we negotiated to stand, Leonardo said finally. The Rossi partnership, the port access, the security guarantees. That protects your family's future without costing anyone their life. In exchange, Camilla does not come near Sienna again, not in any capacity, for any reason, and you will ensure she understands the seriousness of what she's done. Not through punishment necessarily, but through genuine consequence. She needs to understand that actions like this have weight in our world, weight that cannot be undone with an apology. Antonio nodded slowly, something like relief moving through his weathered features. That is more mercy than I expected, Leonardo. More than she deserves, perhaps. I'm not doing this for her, Leonardo said, his eyes flicking to Camilla, cold and final. I'm doing this because more violence solves nothing, and because Sienna asked me to find another way. She's the only reason Camilla is walking out of this office instead of facing something far worse. Camilla's eyes found Sienna's across the room, something complicated and unreadable passing between them. Not gratitude exactly, too proud for that, but a recognition, perhaps, of a mercy she hadn't expected and didn't fully understand. Thank you, Camilla said quietly, the words clearly costing her something significant to say. Don't thank me, Sienna said, her voice steady despite everything. Just don't ever come near me again. I mean that. You have my word, Camilla said. And for the first time since Sienna had met her, she believed it was genuine. After the Morettis left, the office fell into a heavy, exhausted silence, Leonardo sinking into his chair as though the confrontation had drained something essential out of him. Sienna crossed the room and settled onto the arm of his chair, her hand finding his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. You could have destroyed them, Sienna said finally, both of them, and you didn't. I wanted to, Leonardo admitted, his voice rough. Part of me still wants to, Sienna. That's the man this world made me, a man who solves problems permanently, without mercy, because mercy has always felt like weakness in a business built on fear. He turned to look at her, something vulnerable moving across his face. But another part of me, a part that didn't exist before you, wanted to prove something different was possible,
that I could protect what's mine without becoming exactly what my father raised me to be. You did, Sienna said softly, pressing a kiss to his temple.
You found another way, Leonardo. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is.
Leonardo pulled her into his lap, burying his face against her neck, breathing her in like a man finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of everything he'd nearly lost. I love you, he said, muffled against her skin, more than I have words for, more than this contract ever accounted for. Speaking of the contract, Sienna said, a small teasing smile finding its way through the exhaustion, we have 11 days left, Mr. Vitale. What happens then? Leonardo lifted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch, all the exhaustion of the day burning away into something fierce and certain. Then, he said, I intend to make sure you never have a reason to leave.
The final 11 days of the contract passed in a strange, suspended peace. The danger that had shadowed their entire relationship finally, cautiously receding, replaced by something Sienna had almost forgotten was possible. Simple, uncomplicated happiness. Leonardo took her to Italy for 4 of those days, a whirlwind trip to a villa on the Amalfi coast that belonged to his family, perched on cliffs overlooking water so blue it looked painted. They walked through Positano's winding streets hand in hand, ate dinner at small restaurants where no one knew the Vitale name, and for the first time since they'd met, existed simply as two people falling in love, unburdened by contracts or family expectations, or the constant, exhausting performance of appearances. I could stay here forever, Sienna said on their second night, standing on the villa's terrace, watching the sun sink into the Mediterranean in a blaze of orange and gold, Leonardo's arms wrapped around her from behind. We could, Leonardo said, surprising her. I've thought about it, Sienna. Walking away from all of it, the business, the family, the danger, building something simpler somewhere far from New York. You don't mean that, Sienna said, turning to face him, though something in his expression made her reconsider. I mean it more than I've meant anything, Leonardo said quietly, but I also know myself well enough to understand I'd be running from responsibilities I can't actually escape. My mother, my father's health, which isn't what it used to be, the people who depend on Vitale Holdings for their livelihoods. I can't disappear entirely, but I can build something different within the world I've inherited. Something that includes you, permanently, without contracts or 90-day deadlines. Sienna's heart hammered against her ribs. What are you saying, Leonardo? He reached into his pocket, and for one wild, dizzying moment, Sienna thought he was about to produce a ring. But instead, he withdrew a folded piece of paper, offering it to her with hands that for the first time since she'd known him, trembled slightly. She unfolded it carefully. It was the original contract, the 14 pages of legal terms that had bound them together for 90 days, and across the front page, in his sharp, slanted handwriting, he'd written a single line: void. Replaced by something permanent. I had my lawyer draft something else, Leonardo said, his voice rough with an emotion she'd rarely heard from him. Not a contract. A partnership agreement, if you want to think of it that way, though I'd prefer you think of it as a promise. I'm not asking you to marry me yet, Sienna. I know that's too fast, even for us, even after everything we've survived together. But I am asking you to stay. Not for 90 days, for as long as this lasts, which I intend to make forever.
if you'll let me." Sienna's eyes filled with tears, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. "Leonardo, I don't need a document to promise you that. I already know I'm staying." "I know," Leonardo said, cupping her face in both hands, his storm-grey eyes fierce with certainty. "But I wanted to give you something that proves this isn't temporary, that this was never really about 90 days, not for me. It stopped being about the Morettis, about my father's expectations, about anything except you weeks ago. I love you, Sienna Marchetti, completely, recklessly, in a way I never believed myself capable of. Stay with me, not because a contract requires it, because you want to." "I want to," Sienna said, the words breaking on a sob of relief and joy she'd been holding in for weeks. "I love you too, Leonardo. I've loved you since the night you nearly broke Dario's wrist for touching my knee, if I'm being honest. I just didn't have the courage to say it that early." Leonardo laughed, real and unguarded, the sound rare enough that it made her chest ache with tenderness. "That's a very violent moment to fall in love with someone." "You're a very violent man," Sienna said, smiling through her tears. "I fell in love with all of you, Leonardo, the danger included." He kissed her then, slow and searing, the sunset painting them both gold, and for the first time since she'd walked into his office 3 months ago, Sienna felt entirely, unequivocally certain that whatever came next, they would face it together. They returned to New York 2 days later, the danger of Antonio and Camilla Moretti finally, genuinely behind them, the contract officially void and replaced by something real. But even as Sienna allowed herself to believe the worst was over, a new shadow was already gathering, one neither of them had anticipated, rooted not in the Moretti's ambition, but in a secret from Leonardo's own past that was about to resurface with devastating consequences. The shadow arrived 3 weeks later, in the form of a woman Sienna had never seen before, standing in the lobby of Leonardo's building with a child on her hip and an expression of fierce, desperate determination. Sienna recognized trouble before she recognized the specifics. The way the security guards hesitated, uncertain, the way the woman's eyes swept the lobby with the particular urgency of someone who'd rehearsed this confrontation 100 times in her head before finally working up the courage to attempt it. "I need to see Leonardo Vitale," the woman said, her voice carrying an accent Sienna placed as Sicilian, worn thin with exhaustion and something that looked uncomfortably like grief. "Tell him Isabella Conti is here. Tell him it's about his brother." The word brother stopped Sienna cold. As far as she knew, Leonardo had no siblings, an only child, born into a legacy he'd never asked for, the sole heir to everything Salvatore Vitale had built. She approached carefully, aware of the toddler on the woman's hip, watching her with wide, curious eyes. Dark hair and storm-grey eyes that sent an uncomfortable jolt of recognition through Sienna's chest. "I'm Sienna," she said gently. "Leonardo's. I'm with Leonardo. Can I help you?" Isabella's eyes swept over her, assessing, before something in her posture relaxed slightly, recognizing perhaps a fellow woman navigating the treacherous currents of a world built entirely around Vitale men. "I need to speak with him directly. It's about Matteo." "I don't understand," Sienna said carefully. "Leonardo doesn't have a brother." Isabella's laugh was short, bitter, exhausted. "That's exactly what Salvatore Vitale would want everyone to believe." The confrontation that followed, once Leonardo arrived, summoned by a frantic call from the front desk, his face going ashen the moment he laid eyes on Isabella and the child on her hip, unfolded like a slow-motion collapse of everything Sienna had believed about the careful, controlled world Leonardo inhabited. "Isabella," Leonardo said, his voice unsteady, in a way Sienna had never heard from him, not even in the worst moments of danger they'd survived together. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" 20 months, Isabella said, her voice shaking with barely contained fury and grief. 20 months I've tried to reach your father, tried to get an answer about what happened to Matteo, and every single time I was turned away, threatened, told to disappear and take my son with me before something worse happened. I'm done being turned away, Leonardo." "What is she talking about?" Sienna asked quietly, watching Leonardo's face drain of colour entirely. Leonardo was silent for a long, agonizing moment, his eyes fixed on the child in Isabella's arms. A boy, perhaps 2 years old, whose features, Sienna realized with dawning horror, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Leonardo's own. "Matteo was my half-brother," Leonardo said finally, his voice hollow. "My father's son, from an affair he had while my mother was pregnant with me. I didn't know he existed until I was 25 years old, when Matteo showed up at the estate demanding recognition, demanding his share of the family business. My father—" he swallowed hard. "My father had him removed from the family entirely, paid him off, threatened him, made it clear that if he ever tried to claim the Vitale name publicly, there would be consequences." "He didn't just pay him off," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "Matteo is dead, Leonardo. He died 18 months ago. A car accident, they called it, on a road he'd driven 1,000 times without incident, 3 days after he threatened to go to the press about your father's affair, about the child your father refused to acknowledge." Her eyes dropped to the toddler in her arms, her voice dropping to something raw and devastated. "This is his son, your nephew. And I have spent every day since Matteo died terrified that your father will decide he's a loose end, too dangerous to leave alive." The revelation landed in the lobby like a physical blow, and Sienna watched Leonardo's entire world, the careful, controlled version of his family he'd built his identity around, crack open into something far darker and more dangerous than anything Antonio Moretti had ever threatened. "My father had him killed," Leonardo said, the words barely a whisper, horror and fury warring in his voice. "I don't have proof," Isabella said. "Not proof that would hold up anywhere that matters. But I know Matteo, Leonardo. He didn't make careless mistakes on roads he'd driven 1,000 times. And 3 days after he threatened your father—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Leonardo's hands had curled into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with a fury Sienna had never witnessed in him before, not even in the alley the night Sienna had been attacked. This wasn't the controlled anger of a man protecting what was his. This was something deeper, more foundational. The horror of discovering that the father who'd shaped his entire understanding of family, of loyalty, of the rules that governed their dangerous world, might be capable of murdering his own son to protect a secret. "I need you to keep him safe," Leonardo said finally, looking at the toddler with an expression Sienna had never seen on his face before. A fierce, immediate, unconditional protectiveness that transcended everything else happening in that lobby. "Both of you. Whatever it costs. I will not let my father add another body to the list of things he's willing to sacrifice for this family's reputation." "Can you actually protect us from him?" Isabella asked, her voice small, desperate. "He's your father, Leonardo. Your blood." Leonardo's jaw tightened, something cold and final settling into his storm-grey eyes. "My blood," he agreed, "and also, apparently, a man capable of murdering his own child to keep a secret. That ends now, Isabella. I promise you that." Sienna reached for his hand, grounding him, and felt him grip it back with a desperate intensity that told her exactly how close to the edge he was standing. Whatever peace they'd found in Italy, whatever fragile happiness had bloomed in the 11 days since he'd voided their contract, it had just been shattered by a truth far more dangerous than anything the Morettis had ever threatened. A truth that lived at the very heart of the family Leonardo had spent his entire life trying to protect. Salvatore Vitale's study, the same room where he'd once warned Leonardo to protect Sienna properly or not at all, became the site of a different reckoning 3 days later. Leonardo standing across from his father, with a fury so controlled it was more terrifying than any explosion could have been. Sienna beside him, Isabella and the child waiting in a secure location Dante had arranged, protected by men who answered only to Leonardo now. "Matteo," Leonardo said, his voice flat, deadly. "Tell me the truth about what happened to him, Papa. I want to hear you say it." Salvatore's face, for the first time in Leonardo's memory, showed something other than absolute control, a flicker of something that might have been guilt, quickly buried beneath the familiar mask of authority. "Matteo made choices that endangered this family. He was your son," Leonardo said, his voice rising for the first time, the careful composure cracking entirely. "He wanted recognition, Papa. He wanted a place in a family that had already claimed him through blood, whether you wanted to admit it publicly or not. And instead of giving him that, you had him killed and left his son fatherless." "I did not order that boy's death," Salvatore said, and something in his voice, a rawness, a genuine anguish, gave Leonardo pause. "I threatened him, yes. I paid him to disappear, yes. But I did not order his death, Leonardo. I swear to you, on your mother's life, I did not." "Then who did?" Leonardo demanded. Silence stretched between them, heavy and dangerous, and Sienna watched something shift behind Salvatore's flat, weathered eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the particular dread of a man realizing he was no longer entirely certain who he could trust within his own organization. "I don't know," Salvatore admitted finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something significant. "But I have my suspicions, and if they're correct, this goes far beyond one dead son, Leonardo. It goes to the heart of this family's security." "Explain," Leonardo said, his voice still hard, though something in his father's genuine distress had shifted the temperature of the confrontation. "Marco," Salvatore said quietly, and Leonardo went very still. "Your driver. He's worked for this family for 15 years, trusted with everything, including things I've never told you. Matteo came to him first, before he came to me, asking for help reaching out to the family. Marco brought him to me. But I've since learned Marco had his own business dealings with Antonio Moretti, arrangements I wasn't aware of. If Matteo's public claim threatened the alliance Marco was quietly profiting from, the implication hung in the room, devastating in its simplicity. Marco,
the man who'd driven Sienna to countless family dinners, who'd been present the night she was attacked, who Leonardo had trusted implicitly for over a decade, might have orchestrated his half-brother's murder to protect a secret arrangement with the very family that had recently threatened Sienna's life. "He was there the night I was attacked," Sienna said slowly, horror dawning as the pieces began to fall into a darker, more coherent pattern. "Leonardo, he had a direct line to you the entire time. What if the attack wasn't purely Camilla's doing? What if Marco fed information to whoever hired those men, made sure the timeline worked in someone's favor?" Leonardo's expression went cold with a fury that transcended anything Sienna had witnessed from him before. Not the hot, protective anger of the alley, but something colder, more calculating, the particular rage of a man realizing he'd been betrayed by someone he'd trusted with his life and the life of the woman he loved. "Find him," Leonardo said to Dante, who'd been standing silently near the study door throughout the confrontation. "Now, before he realizes we know." But Dante's expression, when he checked his phone a moment later, told them they were already too late. "He's gone," Dante said grimly. "Left the city 2 hours ago, according to his last known location. Someone tipped him off." The room fell into a heavy, dangerous silence, the full scope of the betrayal settling over all of them. Not just a murder 18 months in the past, but an active, ongoing threat. A man with intimate knowledge of Leonardo's entire operation, his movements, his relationship with Sienna, now loose in the world with everything to lose, and likely powerful allies willing to protect him. "This isn't over," Salvatore said grimly, some of his old authority reasserting itself even through the visible weight of guilt and fear. "Marco knows everything. Your security protocols, Sienna's schedule, every vulnerability this family has. If he's working with someone, if he decides to sell that information or use it himself, I know what he's capable of," Leonardo said, his voice hard. "I trained half his instincts myself, Papa. That's what terrifies me most." He turned to Sienna, his eyes fierce with a protectiveness that had sharpened into something almost violent in its intensity. "You're not leaving my sight until Marco is found," he said. "Not for a rehearsal, not for an audition, not for anything. Do you understand me?" Sienna, for once, didn't argue. The danger that had circled the edges of their relationship for months had just revealed itself to be far more insidious than she'd ever imagined. Not a rival family's calculated threat, but a betrayal woven into the very fabric of Leonardo's trusted inner circle. And she understood, with a cold clarity, that the most dangerous chapter of this story had only just begun. They found Marco 4 days later, in a warehouse near the same waterfront where Ombra stood, cornered by Dante's men after a tip from an informant deep within the Rossi organization, who'd recognized him meeting with men connected to a rival family from Chicago, not the Morettis at all, but an entirely separate faction that had been quietly maneuvering to destabilize the Vitale-Moretti alliance for over a year, hoping to seize the port contracts for themselves in the resulting chaos. Marco's confession, delivered in the cold, fluorescent-lit warehouse with Leonardo's gun trained on him and Dante's men blocking every exit, unspooled the truth in full. He'd been feeding information to the Chicago faction for 2 years, drawn in by debts he'd never disclosed to the Vitale family, debts that had made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation this world thrived on. Matteo's death had been his doing,
ordered by his Chicago handlers who'd recognized an opportunity to destabilize the Vitale succession by eliminating an inconvenient half-brother before his claims could complicate an already fragile power structure. The attack on Siena had been his doing too, orchestrated to look like Antonio Moretti's retaliation, designed to trigger exactly the kind of war between the Vitales and Morettis that would leave both families weakened and vulnerable to a Chicago takeover. "You used my brother's death and Siena's life as pieces in someone else's game," Leonardo said, his voice deadly quiet, the gun in his hand utterly steady despite the storm raging behind his eyes. 15 years of loyalty, Marco. 15 years, and it meant nothing against a debt you never told me about. "I didn't have a choice," Marco said, his voice shaking, sweat beading on his forehead despite the warehouse's chill. "They would have killed my family, Leonardo. My sister, her children. You could have come to me," Leonardo said. "I would have protected you. I would have handled it. Instead, you chose to become the exact kind of poison this family has spent generations trying to keep out." What happened next, Siena would never fully learn the details of. Leonardo had insisted she wait outside the warehouse, protected by 2 of Dante's men, and whatever justice was ultimately delivered inside those walls remained, by unspoken agreement, outside the boundaries of what they discussed afterward. She understood enough, from the grim satisfaction on Salvatore's face when he arrived an hour later, from the quiet, exhausted finality in Leonardo's eyes when he finally emerged and pulled her into his arms without a word, to know that the threat, at least, was over. The Chicago faction's attempt to destabilize the alliance collapsed within weeks, their inside source eliminated, their carefully constructed chaos unraveling without the intelligence Marco had once provided. Antonio Moretti, whose innocence in the entire affair had been genuinely confirmed, extended a formal apology to Leonardo, along with an unexpected gesture of goodwill, full support for the Rossi partnership, a permanent end to any expectation of Camilla's marriage into the Vitale family, and a quiet acknowledgement, man to man, that both of them had nearly lost people they cared about to a danger neither had seen coming. Camilla, for her part, disappeared from New York's social circuits entirely, enrolling in a graduate program in Milan that had nothing to do with her family's business. A quiet, self-directed rebellion of her own, Siena suspected, though she never learned the full story and didn't particularly need to. Isabella and her son, whose name Siena learned in the weeks that followed, was Leo, a small, aching coincidence that made Leonardo's throat tighten every time he said it aloud, moved into a house Leonardo purchased for them in Connecticut, close enough for regular visits, far enough to remain safely outside the direct orbit of Vitale business. Leonardo visited every week, without fail, determined to give his nephew the acknowledgement and protection his own father had denied Matteo. "I used to think love in this family always came with a price," Leonardo said one evening, 6 weeks after Marco's betrayal had finally been resolved, standing on the terrace of his penthouse with Siena's back pressed against his chest, both of them watching the city glitter below in the deepening dusk. "I thought loving someone meant eventually losing them, or being forced to choose between them and everything else this family required. Matteo taught me that lesson before I even knew his name. My father chose the family's image over his own son's life." "And now?" Siena asked softly, turning in his arms to face him. "Now I think love is the only thing worth risking everything for," Leonardo said, his storm-grey eyes soft in a way that still, after everything, took her breath away. I spent 32 years building walls to protect myself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. You walked through every single one of them without even trying, Sienna. I don't want the walls back. I'd rather be terrified and honest than safe and alone. He reached into his pocket then, and this time, when he withdrew a small velvet box, Sienna's breath caught in her throat entirely. "The contract's been void for months," Leonardo said, dropping to one knee on the terrace, his voice steady, despite the visible tremor in his hands. "This isn't a performance, Sienna. This isn't 90 days, or a partnership agreement, or anything with an expiration date. This is forever, if you'll have me. Danger, family chaos, and all. I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my entire life. And I don't want to spend another day pretending that isn't true. Marry me." Sienna, tears streaming freely down her face, sank to her knees to meet him at eye level, framing his face in both hands. "You had me at 'you're jealous,'" she said, laughing through her tears. "And you denied it, which was somehow even more convincing." "Is that a yes?" Leonardo asked, something raw and hopeful cracking through his usual composure. "That's an absolutely, unequivocally yes," Sienna said, and he kissed her there on the terrace. The city spread out beneath them in a blaze of light, the ring catching the last of the sunset as he slid it onto her finger, with hands that finally, after everything, had stopped shaking. 3 months later, they married in a small private ceremony at the Amalfi villa where Leonardo had first voided their contract. Renata weeping openly through the entire service, Salvatore standing witness with a gruff pride he didn't bother disguising, Isabella and Leo present as family, truly, for the first time. Sienna's mother, whose medical bills had long since been paid in full, walked her down a garden aisle lined with candlelight, and when Leonardo took Sienna's hands at the altar, his eyes never once left her face. 90 days, he murmured, just for her, as the officiant began the ceremony, was never going to be enough time to fall in love with you. I'm glad we didn't stop when the contract said we should have. Neither am I, Sienna whispered back, and beneath the stars scattered across the Italian sky, in a world built on danger and power and the fragile, ferocious possibility of love that survived it all, they began the only chapter of their story that had never needed a contract at all. The rest of their lives, together, exactly as they'd chosen.